They say the scariest monsters aren't the ones that come crawling from beneath your bed, but the ones who kiss your forehead goodnight and whisper, "I love you." For 7 years, I thought I knew my husband. Ethan Matthews. The man who brought me coffee every morning, who laughed at my terrible puns, who once cried when we lost our dog. The man who swore loyalty to me beneath an old oak tree in Charlotte's Freedom Park while a spring breeze played with my veil. The man who held me close after I miscarried. The man who said we were a team. It wasn't until the Tuesday before our 8th anniversary that I noticed it. A smile. A smile that didn't belong to me. It happened at dinner. Ethan was late again. He came home, smelling like bourbon and expensive cologne. Not his usual scent. I asked about his day. He responded with vague details about meetings running long, clients being demanding. Then his phone vibrated. He looked at it, and he smiled. Not a polite, passive smile, a smile that stretched too slowly across his face, too warmly, too intimately. I had never seen him smile like that at a spreadsheet. I said nothing. But that night, as he slept, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing the outlines of our bedroom in the dark, trying to find familiarity in anything. That smile kept replaying. In my head, who was on the other end of that message? The next day, I scrolled through his public calendar. It was filled with client meetings, boardroom slots, financial forecast calls, but something didn't add up. Too many off-site visits, too many lunches that turned into "I'll be late." I'm not the jealous type. I never have been. But there's a difference between trust and blindness. There's a moment, quiet and irreversible, when your gut shifts from whispering to screaming. Mine was screaming. I brought it up to my best friend Chloe, a licensed therapist who's known Ethan as long as I have. She didn't say much. Just looked at me with that therapist's stillness and said, "Trust your instincts, Rach. But don't react. Observe." So I became an observer. Ethan had a pattern. Thursdays were sacred. Every Thursday he'd leave around 10:30 a.m. for what he called client development meetings. He'd always dress sharper, spray a cologne he never wore for me, and he'd always come home around 2 p.m., cheeks flushed, energy too high for someone who just talked mortgages. It wasn't until I followed him one Thursday that I saw it. He walked into the Ritz-Carlton. Not the lobby cafe, not the lounge, the elevators, alone. But moments before, a young woman, tall, sharp cheekbones, long black hair, the kind of smile that says she's used to being chased, walked in too. Melissa Tran, a name I'd heard mentioned once or twice. "Just a coworker," Ethan had said. Brilliant, but new. They didn't enter together, but I watched. She pressed a number. He did the same. The doors closed. I stood across the street in the rain. And I knew. There's a type of grief that doesn't come with sobbing. It comes with silence, with standing still, with your heart screaming inside your chest while your face stays calm because you're in public. That was the moment I buried, my old life. But I didn't go home and throw a tantrum. I didn't cry on the kitchen floor or scream into his pillow. I called Chloe. Then I called a private investigator. By the following Thursday, I had photos. By the next, video. Room 416. A recurring reservation in his name, masked under a corporate client code. Melissa's name was never listed, but her image was unmistakable in the surveillance footage. Her laughing, her brushing her hand against his chest in the elevator, him pulling her close in the hallway, the door closing behind them. I watched these like someone watching their own funeral. But here's where the story should have ended, right? Wife finds cheating husband. Screams. Divorce. Cue dramatic monologue. But no, that's not where this story ends. Because I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because now, I was no longer the betrayed wife. I was the hunter. I began documenting everything. Receipts, timestamps, company violations, ethics breaches. I pulled every string I could through connections, without revealing my cards. And while I watched my husband disappear further into his own fantasy, I smiled. I asked about his day. I kissed him before bed. I made reservations for our anniversary. I played my role so well, I almost believed it. Why? Because revenge isn't about fire. It's about precision. It's about making sure the blade is sharp, enough to slice through everything they thought was untouchable. Every time he told me he loved me, I smiled back, knowing the clock was ticking on his perfect lie. And yet, as days turned into weeks, a deeper part of me began to stir. Not anger, not sorrow. Something else. Power. For the first time, I wasn't questioning my worth. I wasn't sitting in the shadows of his betrayal. I was crafting my own script. I was becoming the woman I had once buried beneath compromise and sacrifice. I started painting again. I took a solo trip to Asheville and hiked alone. I journaled for hours each night. Not about him, but about me. The pain was still there, of course. But it wasn't defining me anymore. It was shaping me. And yet I still hadn't told Ethan what I knew. Why? Because the game had just begun. And when the time came, I wouldn't just break his heart. I would dismantle his world. At dinner, with friends, and with a smile of my own. But for now, I waited. I learned his moves. I counted the days. I listened to his lies like bedtime stories. Because the man I once loved was already gone. What remained was just a mask, and I was going to be the one to rip it off, slowly, carefully, and in front of an audience. So if you've made it this far, buckle in. Because what comes next? It's not just about cheating. It's about transformation. About the fire you find after betrayal. And how the quietest women often make the loudest justice. If you want to hear how I turned heartbreak into a weapon, how I exposed not just Ethan, but the entire web he was hiding in, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That's how we keep these stories coming, and your support gives us the power to tell the ones they never thought would be told. And now, for those of you listening closely, here's your question. When Rachel saw Ethan enter the Ritz-Carlton, what did she do? A. She confronted him immediately in the lobby. B. She stayed hidden and chose to gather evidence. Comment A or B below. I want to know how many of you would have reacted like me, or chosen the explosive route. There's a moment, after the storm, when everything is eerily quiet. The wind has wrecked what it came to ruin, but the silence that follows. It's colder, sharper, more dangerous. That's where I lived. After confirming Ethan's affair, after watching the footage of him brushing Melissa's hair behind her ear in the dim hallway outside room 416, I didn't fall apart. I didn't rage. I chose something much harder. I chose to stay calm. My friend Chloe had said it best. Don't react. Observe. That advice had already saved me once. Now, it became my mantra. Each morning I woke up beside Ethan, the man I once believed would protect me from the world, and I whispered good morning with a soft kiss, knowing full well that his affection had been shared. Each evening, I watched him text someone under the table, lying to my face with the kind of ease that only practice can bring. I matched his performance. I perfected it. But my silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. I became a scientist, in my own life, measuring data, tracking patterns, Thursday meetings, Friday tenderness. The cycle repeated like clockwork. Melissa's name started to appear more casually in conversation. She's just a kid, honestly. Still figuring out the job, Ethan once said, while sipping wine and twirling pasta on his fork. But she's sharp. I nodded, smiled, filed it away. Every Thursday, I sent him off with a packed lunch and a kiss on the cheek. Then I texted the investigator. I created digital folders, named them innocuously. I tracked license plates, times, transactions. I traced Melissa's Instagram, private, but not protected from her followers. The clues were all there, coded in captions and blurred backgrounds. But while I built my case, something else was quietly rebuilding in me. For years, I had lost pieces of myself in our marriage. Not because Ethan demanded it. He never had to. I offered them willingly, the way many women do when they believe love is sacrifice. I left behind my art studio to support his growing firm. I turned down a promotion at work when he said he needed less chaos at home. I traded long hikes for dinner parties, dreams for shared calendars. But now, with each breath I took in silence, those pieces began returning. I dug out my paints. The canvases were dusty, the brushes stiff, but it was mine. I painted through. The night in the basement, abstract storms and faceless figures, color bleeding from corner to corner, mirroring what I felt but couldn't say aloud. One night, Ethan came downstairs unexpectedly, holding a glass of scotch. "I forgot how good you are," he said, looking at the strokes of violet and red. "Maybe you should show again. You used 2. I shrugged, barely meeting his eyes. "Maybe." That was the first time he noticed the change. It rattled him. I wasn't melting anymore under his gaze. I was reassembling. Chloe and I started weekly walks through Freedom Park. We didn't talk about Ethan every time. Sometimes we didn't mention him at all. Instead, we spoke about joy, about reinvention. She handed me a list one day, things to do alone. At the top was, take a trip, alone, somewhere unfamiliar. So I booked a long weekend in Asheville. Ethan didn't question it. He actually seemed relieved, told me I deserved the break. I smiled at him the way he used to smile at me, warmly, with layers of meaning. It was a smile that said, "You won't know you've lost me until it's too late." In Asheville, I met Sarah and Michael, a couple in their 50s, sitting beside me during a pottery workshop. We got to talking. They asked why I was traveling solo. I told them vaguely about needing space, about recentering. Sarah's eyes softened. "I know that feeling," she said. "Michael and I almost divorced 3 years ago. Infidelity." I blinked. It always surprises you when people are so open. "But we chose to rebuild," she continued. "That's not the right choice for everyone. But I'll say this, don't make decisions while drowning. Let the tide go out first." It struck me. I wasn't drowning anymore. I was floating, watching the shore, deciding which direction to swim. Back home, Ethan was waiting. He'd cleaned the house, folded the laundry, cooked dinner. Guilt does strange things to a man. "You look rested," he said. Lighter. "I am," I replied. "Thank you for holding things down." He smiled, touched my hand. "Of course, we're a team." I nearly laughed. That night, I wrote the final draft of a letter. Not one I would send yet, but one I'd be ready to pull from my drawer when the moment came. It outlined everything: the affair, the times, the evidence, the ethics violations. It wasn't written with rage. It was cold, clean, surgical. I didn't want a dramatic exit. I wanted impact. Over the next few weeks, I set new boundaries, but subtly. I stopped sharing my schedule. I went to sleep earlier, stopped cooking for him. I didn't explain. I simply pulled back, thread by thread, like a magician distracting with one hand while preparing the reveal with the other. One day I left my laptop open, accidentally, on the kitchen counter. My calendar showed an upcoming dinner with Derek. No last name, no details. When Ethan asked, casually, who Derek was, I simply said, Someone I met at the gallery last month. He runs a nonprofit. Then I smiled and walked away. Let him wonder. Let him feel the unraveling. Let him taste the insecurity he had fed me for months. But still, I didn't lie. I didn't cheat. I didn't sink to his level. Because this wasn't about revenge for the sake of pain. It was about clarity. Power. And slowly, it was working. Ethan became more attentive. More reactive. The nights he came home early increased. He'd touch my back in the kitchen, try to kiss my neck. I let him sometimes. Other times, I turned away. "You okay?" he asked one night, brows furrowed. "Of course," I said. "Why, wouldn't I be?" He searched my face for signs of suspicion. He found none, and that scared him. One morning, I received a call from the PI. More footage. This time, they kissed before the elevator. Publicly, sloppily, carelessly. "She's getting bold," he said. "No," I replied. "He is. That's how you know they're close to slipping. And I was right, because affairs thrive in secrecy, in whispers. But the moment they begin to forget that the world is watching, that's when they're weakest." Meanwhile, I explored more of myself. I started yoga, reconnected with an old professor who'd invited me to guest lecture years ago. Began outlining a memoir, not of the affair, but of rediscovering identity after betrayal. I called it The Strategy of Silence. And yet, even with all that growth, there were nights I sat on the floor of my studio, wine in hand, crying, into my knees. Because grief doesn't follow your schedule. It ambushes you. You grieve the person you thought you married, the life you thought was real, the version of you who still believed that love was always enough. But the next morning, I always got up, painted, walked, moved forward. Because when someone breaks your heart, you have two choices. Wait for them. To glue it back together, or build a new one, stronger, on your own terms. I chose the latter. By the end of that month, I had everything I needed. Legal proof, psychological leverage, timing. And now, all that remained was the delivery. Ethan still had no idea what was coming, which made it perfect, because the strategy wasn't just in silence. It was in making sure that when he finally heard the truth, it wouldn't come from me yelling. It would come from me smiling. And that would be louder than any scream. There is an art to devastation. Real devastation doesn't come from shouting matches or broken glass. It's not in red eyes or slammed doors. It's in the moment when a lie, carefully wrapped, nurtured, and repeated, cracks wide open in front of an audience. That moment, when someone watches their world crumble silently in real time, is more powerful than any fury. I chose to make Ethan Matthews feel that kind of devastation. It began with a dinner invitation. I planned it weeks in advance, under the soft guise of celebration. "Just a little gathering," I told him. "For our anniversary, close friends, nothing extravagant." He smiled and agreed without hesitation. Relieved, I imagined, that I wasn't asking questions. By then, his guilt had transformed into arrogance, and arrogance into apathy. He believed I didn't know, that I had accepted the new rhythm of our marriage, that I was either too in love, too naive, or too tired to care. But what he didn't know was that every detail of the evening was curated for impact. There were 8 of us total, Ethan and me, Chloe, of course, her partner Alex, 2 of our longtime friends from Ethan's firm, and lastly, Melissa Tran's fiancé Derek. Yes, she was engaged. That was one of the many quiet, gut-twisting facts I had learned while investigating the affair. I had never met Derek before, but I knew he was charming, successful, and deeply in love. In photos, he had that earnest, all-in expression, the kind that says he still believes in forever. Just like I used to. Inviting Derek wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. About giving someone else what I never had. The full story before it was too late. And to be honest, it was also about control. Not destruction for chaos's sake, but for justice. I wanted Ethan to watch his double life collapse under the weight of his own choices. Not just with me, but with everyone. The evening began like any other. Laughter floated between glasses of red wine and candlelight. Ethan played his role well. Charismatic host, loving husband, confident professional. Melissa hadn't arrived yet. She'd told Derek she had to finish something at work and would be late. The irony made my skin itch. Of course she was late. Of course she believed she could divide her life like slices of a pie, offering sweetness to everyone while hiding the poison underneath. We served dinner. I watched Ethan pass the bread basket to Derek, watched them exchange pleasantries like nothing was burning beneath their feet. I thought I might feel pity, but I didn't. I felt anticipation. Calm, cool, electric anticipation. It wasn't until dessert that I pulled out my phone and connected it to the Bluetooth speaker in the dining room. I said it was a playlist I'd put together for the evening. Jazz, mellow background music to win the night down. Instead, what played was a conversation, not just any conversation. It was audio taken from room 416. It began innocuously. Ethan's voice, low, affectionate. Melissa laughing, her saying his name, his nickname for her. Then, silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of a zipper. A beat passed. The room froze. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide, then focused. Derek's fork clattered to his plate. Ethan went pale. I turned toward him slowly. "Sorry," I said, voice steady. Wrong track. The silence was deafening. Ethan reached for the speaker, but I stepped in front of him. "Let it finish," I said. He didn't. He couldn't. He just stood there, stuck between his dinner guests and the reality he had so carefully hidden. Melissa hadn't even arrived yet. But Derek had, and now he knew. "What the hell is this?" Derek asked, his voice low, shaky. I turned to him. "I'm sorry you had to hear it this way, but I couldn't let you marry someone who was sleeping with my husband." His breath caught. He stood up, fists clenched, and walked out. Chloe followed him. I stayed still, waiting. Ethan tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His face was red now, eyes darting from one guest to another. Our friends looked at their plates. Alex stood and gently guided them out, murmuring some excuse. I didn't stop them. When the room was finally empty except for Ethan and me, he collapsed. "Into his chair, Rachel," he whispered. I sat down across from him. "No," I said. "Don't try. This isn't the moment to apologize. This is the moment to listen." I pulled a manila envelope from the drawer beside me and placed it on the table. Inside were printed photographs, timestamps, hotel bills, and the ethics policy from his firm's handbook. "Melissa's job is at risk, so is yours," I said flatly. "You broke protocol. You lied. You compromised your company's liability. HR will receive this tomorrow morning. You'll both be suspended while they investigate, possibly terminated." He flinched, but I wasn't finished. "You also compromised our marriage. So, here's your copy of the divorce petition. My attorney will be in contact next week." His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, scanning the papers like a drowning man looking for a surface. "You planned this," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "For weeks, maybe months." "You invited Derek." "I did." He looked at me for the first time. Truly looked. "I didn't think you knew," he said. "You were so calm." "Exactly," I said. That was your first mistake. You mistook silence for surrender. I got up and began collecting dishes, clearing the remnants of our final shared meal. Ethan just sat there, small now, sunken. The illusion finally cracked. "Do you hate me?" he asked. I paused, thought about it. "No," I said. "I think I stopped loving you the moment you let her take something from me, without even the decency to tell the truth. Hate takes too much energy. What I feel now is freedom." He didn't reply. He simply sat there as the consequences sank in, as the silence swallowed him whole. That night, I slept alone for the first time in years, and it felt like peace. But that wasn't the end. The next day, Ethan's office was chaos. Melissa didn't show up. Rumors flew. The HR department launched an investigation within hours of receiving the materials I sent. I received a curt email from Ethan that evening asking if we could talk. I didn't reply. Chloe and I met for drinks, toasted quietly to the chapter that had closed. "You did it," she said. "You exposed it all. You took the power back." "I just told the truth," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread. Derek called me once to say thank you. His voice was hoarse. He was moving out. Melissa had confessed everything. He sounded devastated, but also lighter. "It's better I know now," he said. "Before vows, before a house, before kids," I agreed. Ethan continued to spiral. He called, texted, wrote letters, apologies, explanations, excuses. He said he missed me, that it was a mistake, that he didn't mean to fall for her, that it meant nothing, that it meant everything. He contradicted himself so often that even his pleas became meaningless. I saved every message, for court, not for my heart, because by then my heart had already moved on, not to another man, to myself. The great reveal hadn't just destroyed Ethan. It had freed me, and in the aftermath, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power, stillness, clarity. The house was quiet now, but the silence was mine. Not the kind that masks pain, the kind that follows justice. And soon, that silence would become something new. Voice. Because the world needed to hear what happened next. And I was finally ready to speak. There is a strange quiet that follows confrontation. It's not relief. Not at first. It's a void, a vacuum created when the scaffolding of lies finally collapses, and the truth is all that remains. After the dinner, after the reveal, after Derek stormed out and Ethan sat in stunned silence, I braced for the chaos I thought would follow. What I didn't expect was how little I felt toward Ethan anymore. He was no longer my husband. Not really. He was a ghost of the man I once believed in. And now, he simply haunted the ruins of what we used to call a marriage. In the first week after the reveal, Ethan tried everything. There were flowers left at the door. My favorite, of course, peonies. And ranunculus. As if a bouquet could undo betrayal. There were text messages that swung wildly between regret and self-pity. "I miss us," he wrote one morning. "I made a mistake. Please, Rachel, don't throw us away." And then, hours later, "Maybe you're right. Maybe we were never right to begin with." I didn't answer. He left voicemails, too. Some were tearful, some defensive. Once, he drove by the house and parked across the street for nearly an hour. I watched from the kitchen window without moving. I didn't need to confront him. That part of my story was already finished. What surprised me was how many people, especially women, reached out after hearing what happened. Chloe had shared parts of the story with our circle of friends, and soon, messages started pouring in. Some were expressions of solidarity, others were stories of their own heartbreaks, their own silence, their own decisions to stay or to leave. That's when I realized something. What happened to me wasn't rare. It wasn't even unique. It was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one made of quiet suffering, performative forgiveness, and women who swallowed their anger to keep a home intact. I didn't want to be part of that anymore. I wanted to speak. I started small. I posted a blog entry under a pseudonym, a raw, unfiltered piece called The Art of Not Screaming. It wasn't about Ethan specifically, but about betrayal, identity, and what it means to find your voice after someone's tried to take it from you. I shared it with Chloe first. She cried while reading it, and then told me I had to post it. Within a week, the piece went viral in a niche women's empowerment forum. The comments were staggering. Hundreds of women. Some men, sharing their gratitude, their anger, their confusion. It was more than cathartic. It was activating. I created a pen name, R.M. Matthews, and launched a site where I could continue writing. Meanwhile, the practical fallout unfolded in its own rhythm. Ethan was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Melissa resigned quietly before she could be terminated. Word got around. I wasn't smug about it, but I didn't feel guilty either. Actions have consequences. Just because I didn't throw a tantrum didn't mean I wasn't capable of justice. Chloe encouraged me to take time away from Charlotte. "You need distance," she said. "Not just physically, emotionally. Give yourself the space to see who you are without him." So, I went back to the coast. Wilmington. It was a place Ethan and I once visited early in our relationship, but it had always felt more like mine than ours. I found a small Airbnb by the water and brought nothing but my laptop, a few books, and my paints. I walked the beach at sunrise. I wrote for hours in a little cafe on Market Street. I painted at dusk, letting the colors bleed onto the canvas, in a way that felt both chaotic and beautiful. It wasn't healing in the way movies portray healing. It wasn't neat or predictable. It was clumsy, full of moments where I questioned everything. But it was real. One afternoon, I sat on the porch of the rental house, sketching the silhouette of a weathered pier, when an idea came to me. Not just a blog, not just essays, but a book, a memoir, something raw and unapologetic. A story that didn't glorify resilience but told the truth about how messy survival could be. I opened a fresh document and typed the title, He Crossed the Line. The words poured out of me. Chapters structured themselves not by timeline, but by emotional landscape. Denial, rage, silence, clarity. I didn't write about revenge. I wrote about reclamation. What it meant to take your life back from someone who had carelessly borrowed it. What it felt like to wake up from a love story and realize you were the only one holding the pen all along. Back in Charlotte, the world moved on without me. Friends adjusted. Ethan's name faded from my inbox. Derek and I exchanged one more message, just gratitude, nothing more. He was moving to Seattle for a new job and thanked me again for my courage. I told him to stop thanking me. We had both simply done what needed to be done. By the time I returned home, the house felt different, not haunted anymore, just quiet. I rearranged the furniture, painted one of the walls in the living room a deep cobalt blue. I donated the wedding album to a donation center. Something symbolic, but simple. It was never about erasing the past. It was about closing the book and starting a new one on the next shelf. I applied for a small business grant and began laying the foundation for something I had only dreamed about in the margins of my old life. A wellness space for women. Not just yoga or art, but real workshops on boundaries, communication, grief, financial independence, identity rebuilding. I called it the Mirror Room, because every woman I knew who had survived betrayal had one thing in common. They had stood in front of a mirror, broken and unsure, and had to meet themselves again. The launch was modest. Just 20 women in a rented room above a co-op market. But the energy was undeniable. We sat in a circle, sharing stories that had been buried for years. No therapists, no performances. Just truth, raw and tender. Women laughed, cried, released. Afterward, one woman stayed behind. She had graying hair, soft eyes, and the kind of posture that showed she'd spent decades making herself smaller. "Thank you," she said, squeezing my hand. "I've been quiet for so long, I forgot what my own voice sounded like." "That night," I cried. Not out of sadness, out of relief. I had found my way back, not to who I was before Ethan, but to someone wiser, more grounded, more whole. Not everything was perfect. There were nights I still questioned what I missed, or how I could have prevented it. There were days when the old familiar ache resurfaced like a ghost. But those moments became visitors, not residents. They came, they passed, and I stayed standing. One day, Chloe called with news. "You've been invited to speak at the Women's Impact Summit in Atlanta," she said. "They want you to talk about your story, your blog, your project, all of it." I laughed. "I'm not a public speaker." "Well," she said, "you weren't a public survivor either, but look where you are now." I accepted. And in the weeks that followed, I wrote a speech that started not with what Ethan did, but what I had done. How I chose silence not as submission, but as power. How I exposed him not to destroy him, but to rebuild myself. How I stopped waiting to be chosen and chose myself. Because in the end, after the betrayal, after the humiliation, after the wreckage, what remained was something unshakable. Me. The aftershock of infidelity didn't end with court dates or lost jobs. It didn't end with exposed texts or hotel footage. It ended with something softer, something slower. It ended with a woman finding her own hand reaching toward a future she no longer feared. And that, to me, was the real victory. A year had passed since that night, the night I exposed Ethan, the night the carefully maintained image of our marriage dissolved under the weight of truth. 1 year since I sat across from the man I had once loved and showed him the wreckage of the life he thought he could live in secret. A year since I chose myself. It's strange what time does. It doesn't erase pain, but it reshapes it. Grief softens around the edges. Memories no longer claw at your skin. They simply visit now and then, like an old ache that flares up in the cold. But what remains, what grows stronger, is clarity, and strength, and peace. The divorce had been finalized months earlier. My attorney was sharp, and my case was ironclad. Ethan, stripped of his job and his reputation, had little to fight with. The proceedings were civil, but cold. He made one last attempt to reconcile during our final mediation, some desperate monologue about redemption and rebuilding. I listened without interrupting. Then I stood, shook the mediator's hand, and walked away. He didn't follow. That was the last time I saw Ethan Matthews. The book, He Crossed the Line, had been published independently 6 months after that. I hadn't expected much. Maybe a few hundred readers, a few women who saw themselves in my words. But it exploded in ways I hadn't imagined. Thousands of downloads, messages from across the country. Women saying thank you, women telling me their stories, women asking for permission to stop forgiving what had never been apologized for. I didn't just give them my story, I gave them a mirror, and they looked. The mirror room, too, had grown. From a single rented space above a co-op to a full-scale center. We now had 3 rooms, one for workshops, one for art and movement, and one quiet room, a soft space for anyone who needed stillness. I hired counselors, facilitators, legal advisors, not to replace therapy, but to bridge the space between breaking and rebuilding, to create a space where women didn't have to justify their anger, or minimize their hurt, or ask for permission to move on. I still remember the day a woman named Tasha walked in, shoulders hunched, eyes wide and hollow. She had just discovered her partner of 9 years had a second family in another city. She couldn't speak for the first hour, just sat in the circle listening. 2 weeks later, she spoke. 6 weeks after that, she led a workshop on reclaiming identity through storytelling. It wasn't just me anymore. It was all of us, building something from the wreckage. Still, I had not seen or heard anything about Melissa, not until recently. One morning, as I walked into a local cafe for my usual tea, I saw her. She was thinner, pale, standing in line ahead of me. She turned, and for the briefest second, our eyes met. She froze. I didn't flinch. She took her drink and left without a word. I didn't follow. There was nothing to say. I didn't hate her. That would have given her too much power. I had moved so far past the version of myself that once felt betrayed by a woman I didn't even know. The betrayal had never been about Melissa. It had always been about Ethan, about the promises he broke, about the life he abandoned while still pretending to live it. Melissa was a symptom. Ethan was the disease, and I had already healed. But perhaps the most unexpected twist in all of it came one Friday afternoon, as I prepared for a guest speaking event in Atlanta. I was set to close out the Women's Impact Summit. It was a surreal full-circle moment. Me, once the woman crying, into her hands in a silent kitchen, now the keynote speaker for a room of 500. I sat backstage, flipping through my notes, when a volunteer knocked lightly and said, "Someone's here to see you. Says his name is Daniel." I looked. Up Daniel was an old friend of mine from college. We hadn't spoken in years. He'd moved to Oregon after graduation. We'd dated briefly in our 20s, but parted ways with kindness and clarity. Seeing him now, standing in the hallway in a tailored blazer, holding a copy of my book with a tentative smile, felt like seeing the ghost of a life that could have been, but not in a painful way. "I'm here for work," he said. "But when I saw your name on the program, I had to come." We talked, briefly, and then he sat in the audience. I delivered my speech from the stage with calm conviction. I spoke not just of betrayal, but of resurrection. Not just of pain, but of possibility. I told the room that they were not alone, that silence can be sacred, but also sharp. That survival isn't the end of the story. Reinvention is. When the applause came, I stood still for a moment, soaking in the sound. I was no longer Rachel Matthews, the wife of a man who cheated and lied. I was Rachel. Just Rachel. Writer, speaker, founder, survivor. And something else too, a woman ready to trust again. Daniel and I had dinner that night. We didn't talk about the past much. He knew the story. Everyone did by then. But he never made me explain myself. He didn't ask me to shrink or soften or skip over the messy chapters. He just asked me what I was painting these days, what I was dreaming about, where I saw myself in 5 years. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew I was no longer afraid to find them. As the seasons changed, I began to notice the little things. The sound of morning birds, the way the light hit the window at 7 a.m., the pleasure of slow Sundays spent with books and bare feet. I no longer counted my life by the moments Ethan was part of. I measured it in color, in clarity, in truth. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of my old self, her soft hopefulness, her willingness to believe in people too quickly. And I didn't grieve her. I just thanked her for getting me this far. Because it was she who had survived, and it was I who would carry us forward. In the final pages of my book, I wrote something I hadn't intended. A note not to Ethan, or to Melissa, or even to the women reading. A note to the woman I once was. You will not stay broken. You will not always tremble. One day you'll wake up and feel the sun again, and it will not remind you of him. It will remind you of you. And when that day comes, you'll know the story is yours again. Not because he left, but because you chose to begin. So I leave you here, dear reader, with this truth. Love is not blind, but betrayal blinds you. What clears your vision is not revenge. It's the rebuilding, the rewriting, the rising. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own voice, subscribe, share it, and tell us your answer to this. What's the greatest freedom after heartbreak? A. Forgiving the one who hurt you. Becoming someone they never imagined you'd be. Comment A or B below. And if you're still finding your way back, know this: you're already on your way. Rachel Matthews' story is not simply one of betrayal, it is one of rebirth. At its surface, it's a tale we've heard too many times. A seemingly loving husband, a secret affair, a woman left to pick up the emotional debris. But beneath that, something far more powerful unfolded. When Rachel discovered her husband, Ethan, was having an affair with a colleague, Melissa Tran, her world didn't fall apart as much as it cracked open. In that crack, in that sliver of space between shock and surrender, she found something she hadn't seen in years. Herself. She didn't confront Ethan with rage. She didn't scream, shatter dishes, or post dramatic rants online. She didn't seek pity. Instead, she chose silence. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of strategy. She collected evidence. She studied his movements. And most importantly, she gave herself space to remember who she was before her marriage began to define her. Rachel became an architect of her own recovery. The reveal, carefully orchestrated over a dinner party, was not just a moment of exposure. It was a reckoning. With Derek, Melissa's fiancé, present, and a group of mutual friends watching, Ethan's facade was stripped away in a single, deliberate moment. The truth didn't need to be screamed to be heard. It was played calmly, through a Bluetooth speaker, turning the air in the room to glass. The power Rachel wielded wasn't in volume. It was in precision. But the real transformation began afterward. Rachel didn't stop at justice. She moved beyond it. She didn't let betrayal define her identity. Instead, she used it as a catalyst to reshape her life. She built something from the wreckage. She wrote a memoir, He Crossed the Line, that became a beacon for other women navigating heartbreak. She launched the Mirror Room, a wellness space where women could grieve, heal, and rediscover themselves without apology. She turned her pain into purpose. Her journey wasn't linear. There were nights of loneliness, moments of questioning, even shadows of doubt. But with every step, Rachel moved forward, not back to who she was before Ethan, but forward into someone, stronger, more honest, more whole. She no longer measured her worth by a relationship. She measured it by the life she was now leading on her terms. Even when confronted with the ghosts of her past, like the brief encounter with Melissa at the cafe, Rachel chose peace over confrontation. She no longer needed revenge. Her success, her serenity, her freedom, that was the loudest response of all. And when an old friend from her past, Daniel, re-entered her life, it wasn't as a replacement for Ethan. It wasn't to fill a void. It was a reflection of who she had become, a woman ready to love again, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, on her own terms, without shrinking to fit anyone else's expectations. So what can we learn from Rachel's journey? The deepest lesson is this: pain does not have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of your transformation. When betrayal strikes, our instinct is often to either explode or retreat, to burn it all down or to crumble. But there's a third path, the quiet one, the strategic one, the one where you breathe, step back, assess, and choose your response not from pain, but from power. Rachel teaches us that healing isn't passive. It's a deliberate act. It's waking up every day and choosing yourself again and again. It's not waiting for closure or for someone else's apology. It's finding your own peace and letting that be enough. In our current world, where image is curated and social media encourages instant reaction, her story is a reminder of the power of graceful control, of acting when you're ready, not when you're triggered, of moving forward with purpose, not vengeance. And most of all, her story reminds us that no matter how far you've strayed from your own reflection, it's never too late to look in the mirror and begin again. You don't have to be perfect. You don't even have to be ready. You just have to be willing to let go of who they thought you were, willing to rediscover who you really are, willing to rebuild. Now, it's your turn. Let's keep the conversation going. If you were in Rachel's position, what do you think is the most powerful step in taking your life back? A. Quietly collecting your strength and acting strategically. B. Letting it all out immediately and confronting everything head-on. Drop your answer in the comments, A or B, and share why. Your voice matters, and you never know who else might need to hear your perspective today. What about you? What would you have done differently? Or what part of Rachel's story resonated the most with you? Comment below and let others learn from your insight. And if this story moved you, even a little, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what helps us keep bringing these powerful, emotional journeys to light. With every like, comment, and subscription, you help create a space where stories like Rachel's can inspire others to rise again. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, choose yourself, every time.